Paul Puey. He is the CEO and founder of Edge Wallet, and he has lots of accomplishments, and I think he's going to have some great insights for us today. So let's give him a round of applause and welcome.
Tom, thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Sounds like this is more of a privacy conference. So far, exactly. So I'm going to try to give you guys a little bit of a walk down memory lane in history to both show you why. I think you've already heard a lot of the why for privacy. I think a lot of you just being into Litecoin and being interested in it, because of its integration of MWeb, are probably already on the path of like, all right, I know I care about privacy in general, but maybe your friends don't. And you need to convince not just the people in this room, but people around the world as to the why of privacy. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history on why it's important. Just privacy in general, not necessarily financial privacy. And then, more importantly, is what is crypto's path to achieving privacy? And why is it that governments actually will want privacy in our transactions, where most of us fear that governments are going to clamp down on it? All right, let's go next slide. So just a brief intro on myself. My name is Paul Puey. I'm CEO and co-founder of Edge. Our company's been around the space for quite some time, since 2014. We do care heavily about privacy. We were the first mobile app, as Johnny Crypto had mentioned. Really important to have mobile apps that support self-custody and privacy. We're the first to integrate Monero as a multi-asset app, as well one of the first to integrate Zcash in full privacy mode, as opposed to this kind of optional privacy. Okay, next slide. So why privacy? Most people, probably not in this room, say I've got nothing to hide. I'm not doing any illicit activities. I'm not money laundering, drug trafficking, or whatnot. So why should I have or care about or go through the hoops to use tools that give me additional privacy? Next slide. So there's some good. I'm going to give you some good and some great reasons for that. So many people, I think this was already mentioned, you don't want people to know necessarily where your wealth is. What is your wealth? If anything, that's kind of a personal security issue. As well, what are your monthly expenses? If you think about it, just from the viewpoint of negotiating with the jobs, do you really want all of the people that you negotiate with to know exactly what you need to live? Right? Or what you're currently earning? That's one of the things that's actually outlawed. You can't ask someone, hey, what are you currently earning, before you put out an offer to hire them. Without that level of financial privacy, there's a chance that you're leaking that info. How much you're earning on a regular basis when you're doing negotiations. And as a company, there's many reasons why companies will want privacy. We hear the term corporate espionage, a term that means companies knowing what other companies do gives them an inherent advantage. How much you pay your staff would help them cherry pick staff away from your company. They know how much they can offer above or below what that current amount is. And of course, trade secrets. Health information. What is our current health? That helps. Keeping that private helps prevent discrimination within hiring. We're not allowed to ask, hey, what's wrong with you in your health? As long as you can do the job, you should be hireable. So there's some generally good reasons for privacy that I think a lot of people will relate with. But what are some great reasons for privacy? So next slide. Next slide again. Sorry. Transitionary. One thing people forget today is, sure, you're not doing anything wrong. You're not breaking the law. You think you're not breaking the law. But what's legal today could be illegal tomorrow. So let's jump back into the mid to late 1950s in China. There was a push by the Communist Party to actually hear feedback from the citizens on what they liked and disliked about government and policy. It was called the 100 Flowers Campaign. With all of these ideas, maybe 100 flowers of ideas, something will bloom. Harry Wu was an activist, that's the person pictured here, who was hesitant when he'd heard about that campaign. But he said, okay, I have a lot of issues with the government. He had issues with how China was partnering with Russia and their involvement in Hungary at the time, and how China was starting to classify citizens and put them in certain categories, eventually determining their livelihood. He spoke out. Come about a year later, they took and rolled back that policy and suddenly said those people who had shared that information are now the biggest targets and the kind of anti-establishment people to go after. At first, Harry was singled out within the university that he is studying and working at, but eventually actually put in jail. The kind of thoughts that you have today may not be what governments want to hear tomorrow. And they actually retroactively jailed him for what he had shared prior. Not saying that that's going to happen here today in the US, but realize that there is a precedent for this. And as things get worse and worse, and as governments get more and more desperate, this is something they can and have done. All right, next slide. Whistleblowing. Poor Julian Assange. Just trying to tell the truths of the world. And this might be at a very high level, like you see here in this photo. This is him whistleblowing on one of the largest governments in the world. But it could be something smaller. It could be just at the place that you work. It could be local government. And your ability to both whistleblow and continue with your livelihood is predicated on a high level of privacy. Not knowing who you are, you're just simply sharing information. All right, next slide. And here's a really interesting one. How many people have heard of the cardboard box reform theory? Probably none of you. It's a debated but highly interesting theory that I highly recommend all of you look up. It's by James D'Angelo. He was an ex-NASA scientist, MIT grad and researcher, and he noticed something interesting that happened around 1970. And of course, in 1970, we also went off the gold standard. So a lot of things happened in around 1970. But he also noticed a sudden spike in lobbying efforts. Money that went into lobbying shot up. Income inequality shot up. The tax code shot up. What we had in 1970 was about 18,000 pages of tax code. Who likes having to filter through all of the tax rules in order just to file their taxes? It's like government, just like, you're already taking my money, at least make it easy. But it shot up from about 18,000 pages to, in 2010, about 70,000 pages of tax code. And he noticed in that tax code were really just a lot of exceptions for various special interest groups. So he dug in and he looked into, why is this? And the theory was one thing notable happened. The Legislative Restructuring Act of 1970. Prior to 1970, the House of Representatives would vote on various legislation. We hire these people to vote for us. But that vote would be entirely within the House, and it wasn't allowed to leak outside. In 1970, they installed these digital voting machines inside the House. They would record that and literally post it publicly. Now it's posted on the internet. You can go to a site and see exactly how all of your constituents voted. That sounds like a good thing. How many people have heard of these blockchain voting transparency projects? Have you ever heard of any one of these? I'm sure you have. I'm sure some of you have. And they sound good. James D'Angelo was actually torn. He was huge in the Bitcoin space. He created tons of great Bitcoin educational videos. He was about financial privacy, but also transparency of government. So he was torn because he's like, wow, this is something that I thought I wanted, but it inherently seemed to transcend into corruption. Next slide. Because if you think about it, the foundation of our voting as individuals is rooted in privacy. We walk into a voting booth, close the curtain behind us, and nobody knows how we vote. Imagine if, when voting, you were out in the clear and you had to yell it out out loud who you voted for, what propositions you voted for. Would it affect your vote? Some of you might say no, but by and large, yes. The people next to you know how you vote. I mean, there's a lot of people who, especially in this bubble, won't necessarily want to share, especially the party lines that we're voting on today. All right? Not trying to get into politics. A lot of people loved Trump. Many didn't want to share that. Whether you love it or hate it, they felt much more of a need for that level of privacy. The three main things that open, transparent voting creates, voter fraud, vote buying, and intimidation, are rife. Next slide. And Wikipedia nailed it on the head. They actually removed this little section in Wikipedia. But if you can read this, the secret ballot, in which only the voter knows the individuals have what and how the individuals have voted, is a crucial part of ensuring free and fair elections. They nailed it. But why don't we have that? So I realize this talk is going from what you've been accustomed to with this financial privacy to something that's very political, but it really is rooted in the same concept of us needing and wanting and deserving privacy. All right, next slide. So let's go back now into the history of technology privacy. We understand that we need privacy in general, but how are we going to get that going forward? Why is the government actually going to allow us to have financial privacy in the future? Well, let's roll back time and look at the history of cryptography, encryption. It's 1989. Tim Berners-Lee invented the HTTP protocol, allowing us to surf the internet in a much more friendly way. Punch in our browser URL, starts with HTTP. What does that stand for? The Hypertext Transport Protocol. And in '89, when you did that, everything that you sent to a website and everything you received from a website was in the clear between you and every node on the internet before it got to that server and back. And for the most part, we were still excited about the internet. We just wanted to be able to access these random little web pages, whether they be pictures of cats or messages to our friends, emails, and whatnot. But that was HTTP. Next slide. Come 1994, and Netscape, the company, one of the original browser developers, created HTTPS, which by and large is widely adopted today. You see it on the browsers, that little green lock icon. And what does that mean? What does it mean when you have that green lock icon? Now invisibly, you are encrypting messages between you and that server that you're communicating with. And no party in the middle, by and large, is able to access that information. Next slide. However, what was the government response? Wanting to ban encryption or put backdoors in it, make sure we have a key so that we can see all of that data. So to read this little snippet of this bill that was proposed by Senator Charles Grassley, this bill, in effect, would criminalize the distribution of all encryption software over the internet or other computer networks unless the software at issue used a universal decoding device or program that was provided to the Department of Justice prior to the distribution, meaning they had a backdoor to all encrypted data. That was their response at that time. And there was a huge faction within the government that wanted to push this forward. Ban encryption unless they had a backdoor. Ban encryption unless they had a backdoor. But where are they today? Next slide. They've done a full 180. This is a government website, an official website of the United States government on the upper left. It is the HTTPS only standard, meaning that you are now mandated to use HTTPS when accessing when providing a government website, as well for banking websites, healthcare websites. All of them are required. They are now pushing encryption for general purpose traffic on the internet that uses HTTP. Now you have to use HTTPS. So why the sudden flip? Let's next slide. What changed within the government? The biggest thing was commerce, meaning we actually needed the internet to drive our economy. Merchants, people wanted to actually transact over the internet. They had to put their credit card information, or they wanted to access the government website as opposed to having to walk into a physical branch. They wanted to provide healthcare information without, once again, having to get actual paper documents. So it's actually the utility of the internet, the widespread adoption of it, that demanded the need for encryption. And if you think about it, the government's just a bunch of people. We as people want this level of privacy, so do those people that are also in the government. And if they're dependent on this technology, they'll want that same level of adoption change. All right, next slide. Another thing is that people change. Some of the old crusties, that don't want to change and, are rooted in their ways, they eventually pass on. 2010 was Prop 19 in California, which was the attempt at legalizing cannabis. And it failed. Only about 46% of the population voted for it. 6 years later, 2016, Prop 64 passed by about 57% positive vote. One thing to note, about every year in the US, about 1% of the population dies, and about 1% of the population is born. So it's about 6% population change between 2010 and 2016. That was about half of the voting difference. So for every 1% that's born, that's about 1% that becomes voting age. And that 1% that dies is 1% that is no longer voting age, right? And that's an inherent, almost somber, but positive truth about how new technology is going to get adopted. Right? People inherently change, and the government is nothing more than actual people. So those two little nuggets are how both cryptocurrency as a whole and privacy in crypto are really going to be adopted. And realize a lot of the talks come prior to this are so key in that, is that we have to get crypto used. They said commerce is what really drove the adoption of HTTPS. Merchants demanded it, we needed it, people demanded it, needed it because they wanted to use the internet. Now, if we drive adoption of things like MWeb and other privacy protocols and make it easy to use, and the individuals and people in the government start wanting to use it for themselves, they will have no choice but to also adopt legislations that say, this is mandated, we have to use this. And we'll start to wither away a lot of the kind of optional or poor privacy cryptocurrency, which is the equivalent of the 1989 HTTP. And that fundamentally, I feel like, is our path forward. All right, next slide. And so with that, that's kind of a wrap. Happy to open up with any questions if we have any time. And I didn't tell you a whole lot about what we do at Edge, but if anyone would like to try an app that definitely promotes a high level of privacy and ease of use within that, feel free to download it, give it a try. RJ on our team is over here. He's wearing an Edge shirt. We'll happily send you $5 in Litecoin to give it a try as a new user. And with that, thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully let's drive privacy, financial privacy, all sorts of privacy out into the future.